Welcome to Train Signal. You are watching the video for Lab 2, Creating New Sites and Subnets for benandbrady.com. In this video, you will learn how to map the logical domain to the physical network. So far, we have created a domain called benandbrady.com, which is entirely logical. Now what we will do is, we will associate this domain benandbrady.com to the domain controllers that are actually located in two different locations. So we will map our logical domain to the physical network. To do this, we will create new site objects, we will create new subnets, and then we will associate these sites with the subnets. This is a three-step process that will let you link the logical domain to the physical network, and I'm going to show you detailed configuration and steps as to how to accomplish this. And finally, we will make sure that our Active Directory replicates between the sites that we have created. So first, let's begin by defining what an actual site is. So going back to my diagrams over here, this is the first network diagram that we have accomplished so far. Here's our physical layout. We had two switches and there were two domain controllers to the first switch. This was one network. In fact, this is the 201.0 network. This is the second network to the switch 2, which is the 202.0 network, and the router is connecting network 1 and network 2. Now, this is the physical layout of a network. What we need to do is map this to the logical layout, and here's what the logical layout looks like. I'm going to take you to another figure over here that I have drawn for the benandbrady.com network. Here's physically how the benandbrady.com network looks like. There are two different geographical locations, also known as sites. One location is California, and at the California location, the network ID will be 200.200.201.0. At the North Carolina location, the network ID is going to be 200.200.202.0. So these are two different physical networks separated by a router over here. So I've just shown a routing device over here that is connecting the two sites. Now, on the first site over here are our two domain controllers, DC1 and DC2, and the second site over here has the third domain controller, which is DC3. Now, here's the difference between the physical network that we've created and the logical network that we would like to accomplish. Let's take an example. Let's say that there is a user in North Carolina, and this particular user would log on to a domain controller. So when this person enters a username and password, the credentials are passed on to a domain controller. The question is, to which domain controller? I'll pause a little bit over here and see if you can answer this question. When a user logs on to a domain, the user basically enters the username, the password, and hits the OK button. That information goes to which domain controller? DC1, DC2, DC3, or the last option is you do not know. Well, hopefully you got the right answer. The correct option over here is that you do not know which domain controller is actually going to log in this particular user. Now, it would be nice that if the user is in North Carolina, the domain controller DC3 would log this person in, simply because in North Carolina, DC3 is connected to all the other clients in that particular network as a local area network running at 100 megabits per second on Ethernet, or at least 10 megabits per second if you're using the old Ethernet cables. However, if that packet consisting of username and password were to reach either DC1 or DC2, well, it would have to cross the WAN connection over here. Even if this is a T1 line, which in this case it is at 1.5 megabits per second, it would cross the T1 line over here, go to the domain controller, the packet would then be built up, the access token will be built up, and the access token would come back across the WAN line again to the user, and then the login would take place in that manner. Obviously, that is not an efficient manner to work. In fact, if a lot of traffic goes back and forth like this throughout the day, you will not have any useful bandwidth left for productive work to be done. So in this manner, our physical network and logical networks are not the same. We need to actually define exactly what takes place in a physical network when a user logs in, or when other types of replication takes place. And this will be tackled in this particular video and the next video. In this particular video, we will first focus on creating a site and basically separating the California site from the North Carolina site. And in the next video that follows, I will show you how the replication between the domain controllers will take place between these sites. So to begin with, let's first start by defining what is a site. I'm going to take you back to my notes, and going on to the second sheet of this note. Here we go. What is a site? A site is a grouping of one or more TCP/IP subnets that defines the physical structure of a network. This is a technical definition of a site. Let's begin to understand what a site is by looking at a more generic definition that I have come up with. A site is nothing but a geographical location or a branch of a company. This is basically considered a site. For example, let's say that this company is headquartered in California. And in fact, in the California location, they have a branch in the city of San Francisco. So the computers that are connected by means of a fast connection in San Francisco are considered a site. Now, technically speaking, if the computers are connected over a LAN, it is considered a site. Now, what is a LAN? Typically, a LAN is defined as a set of devices or computers connected to each other with at least 10 megabits per second or greater. In other words, when you set up a LAN, you are using the Ethernet cable, and the minimum speed on the Ethernet cable nowadays is 10 megabits per second, the maximum speed at this point being 100. In fact, you can also have a gigabit network at this point at 1000 megabits per second, but for most practical purposes, it's between 10 and 100 megabits per second. So if devices are connected between 10 to 100 megabits per second, you can safely say that they are considered in the same site, simply because they are well connected for the Active Directory to work in the most efficient manner. So taking our example of San Francisco one more time, all the computers in a San Francisco location in our case are connected at 100 megabits per second Ethernet, and hence they're considered a site. Now the second location for this company is Charlotte, North Carolina, and over there the two different locations are linked to each other by means of a T1 connection. T1 works at 1.54 megabits per second. Because this particular connection works at 1.54 megabits per second, which is less than 10 megabits per second, well, the two are considered two different sites. In other words, one of the sites is North Carolina. This is Charlotte location. The other site is San Francisco in California. Once again, all these computers over here are connected at 100 megabits per second, and for our practical purposes, that is considered as one site. The computers over here are considered as one site, and the two sites are connected to each other by means of a T1 connection, which is at 1.54 megabits per second, and hence they're considered as two different sites, and these two sites are linked to each other by means of a T1 line. So in other words, for all practical purposes, as long as the devices are connected to each other at a speed of 10 megabits per second or better, they're considered the same site. If not, they're considered two different sites. Let's take some more example. Let's say that within California itself, let's say that this company were to open up a new branch in San Diego, and again, San Diego is much further apart, from San Francisco as well. So between San Francisco and San Diego, you would need a T1 line, and again, that would be considered two sites. Now let's take another example, that in San Francisco, this company were to acquire a different office within the same office building, for example, and then they uplink the two locations. In other words, let's say the office is on the 3rd floor and the new office is acquired on the 10th floor. And if by some means, if they can uplink the two together so that the LAN works at least 10 megabits per second or 100 megabits per second preferably, even though they're two different physical locations, they would be considered the same site simply because of the fast network connection. If you really think about it, anything that is less than T1 would be considered a site. For example, let's take the slowest connection that's possible, which is impractical but still possible, the dial-up connection. Using a modem, you can achieve a speed of 56 kilobits per second. So if there are two locations connected by means of a modem, they are definitely considered sites. Going up a little bit, let's go on to DSL or cable modem. These connections typically work between 300 to 600 kilobits per second. Once again, they're considered two different sites. In other words, if two different locations are connected by means of a DSL or cable connection, then the two will be considered sites simply because the speed is going to be between 300 to 600 kilobits per second, which is much less than 10 megabits per second. That is a definition of a LAN, or the definition of devices connected to each other within the same site. Going up, T1 line, which is about 1.54 megabits per second, again considered sites. The only other connection that is practical is of practical use today that can be considered the same site is the T3 connection, which works at 54 megabits per second. So if there are two locations, for example, if California and North Carolina were connected to each other by means of a T3 connection, which runs at 54 megabits per second, that would definitely be considered a LAN. In other words, even though that these two locations are connected geographically and they're separated by several hundred miles, they will still be considered a site simply because of the fast connection between the two. In fact, if this company were to have a location in Australia, and you would connect the two locations to each other by means of a T3 line, they would still be considered a site simply because of the connection speed of 54 megabits per second. So in other words, for most practical purposes, this is what we will consider as a site. If two locations are connected by means of a T1 line or less, they will be considered a site. If the two locations are connected by means of T3 line or something better than that, then they will be considered the same site. So that way we'll be able to separate our geographical location from a physical network, which is still benandbrady.com. So to summarize this, a site is simply a grouping of one or more TCP/IP subnets, and I'll explain what one or more means. Okay, but basically it's a grouping of TCP/IP subnets that constitutes one physical structure. So there is a structure in California, there's another structure in North Carolina, and the two are connected to each other by means of a T1 line, and that defines them as two different sites. Now, what do I mean by one or more TCP/IP subnets? Well, let me make this a little bit more clear. Let's say that in the California location over here in San Francisco, you set up a second network called Worldwide Ice Cream. All right, you're setting up a second domain called Worldwide Ice Cream. And then you want to link the two domains, or even keep it separate if you want together. Our Worldwide Ice Cream would be, let's say, an additional tree in the same forest, and benandbrady.com would still simply be a different domain or different tree within the same forest. Even though they're two different logical domains, they are still considered within the same site simply because the devices between the two domains will be connected to each other by means of Ethernet, which is running at 100 megabits per second. In other words, in one site, which is California, I can set up more than one logical domains or logical networks. I can have benandbrady.com, I can have worldwideicecream.com. If this company were to go and acquire a different company, jackandjill.com, that would also be in the same site. In other words, in the same site, now I have three logical domains: benandbrady.com, jackandjill.com, and worldwideicecream.com. All right, so in the same site, you can have multiple logical domains. On the other hand, one logical domain, which is benandbrady.com, can span multiple sites. In other words, in our scenario over here, we just have one domain, benandbrady.com, and that is spanned across two different sites. The point that I'm trying to make clear over here is that the logical domains and the physical networks have actually no correlation between each other the way we have set up. In fact, it is our duty to have some correlations between the two so that the networking and the moving of packets from one location to another are efficient. Okay, and that's exactly what we are trying to achieve. Now let's go ahead and see how this can be done. So I'm going to minimize all the connections over here, and to begin with, let's go to DC1, our domain controller DC1, and let's check out the sites the way it has been created so far. So far, benandbrady.com is not aware that I have actually two physical sites. In fact, we will be doing that soon. So what it did was it created all the domain controllers in the first site, which is the default site. Now, let's first check out exactly how to look at these sites and how to make changes over there. The tool that you use for this is called Active Directory Sites and Services and is located in the administrative tools. So in the admin tools, let's pick up this tool called Active Directory Sites and Services, and I'm going to give you a little tour of this tool. You expand the first container over here called the sites container. So I'm going to expand sites, and within the sites container, you see that it has created the first site known as the default first site. In fact, this is the name that we used in our answer file when we created the first domain controller, DC1, for the benandbrady.com domain. I'm going to expand default first site, and by doing so, it gives me a container that says servers. This container lists all the domain controllers of benandbrady.com. So I'm going to expand this, and here we go. We have created three domain controllers, DC1, DC2, DC3, they're all listed. I'm going to expand the first domain controller, and in there is a setting called, or there is a link called NTDS settings. This is the NT directory settings container or link, and if I select that on the right hand side, it shows me what are known as connection objects. Now let me explain to you exactly how this works. We are on the domain controller DC1, and by selecting the NTDS settings for DC1, I see two different connection objects, DC2 and DC3. What this is telling us is that DC1 is connected to DC2 and DC3, and these are the connection objects that is linking them together. This is how Active Directory is replicated. We will talk a little bit more about this in the next video, but just to make sure that our domain is working efficiently, what I'm going to do is select one of these links over here. This basically says that from server DC2 to DC1, because I went over here from DC1. So once again, I'm on DC1, and on DC1 I've selected the link for DC2. I'm going to right click, and then over here select this object called replicate now. Clicked on it and it says that Active Directory has replicated the connections. So this was a good message. Make sure that you can replicate your domain in this manner before you proceed ahead. If not, then you have issues between the communications of domain controllers in your domain. All right, and this should happen across all domain controllers. So I have successfully replicated. Let's click on the OK button. And just to get some practical value out of this lab, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the domain control over here on DC1 and then run the tool Active Directory users and computers, and let's create our two OUs, one for each site. The first OU I'm going to create is going to right click on benandbrady.com, new organizational unit, and let's create the OU called California. Click on OK. Now what I'm going to do is minimize this connection totally and go to DC2 as an example, and then over here create a new OU. Remember, I can go to any of these domain controllers and modify the Active Directory from there. So DC1 I created a new OU called California. On DC2 what I'm going to do is create a new OU called North Carolina. So here we go, and let's call this NC for North Carolina. Click on OK, and I'm done with this, so I'm going to close this and then go back to DC1. Alright, so going back to DC1, let's go back to our tool, go to close this. Active Directory sites and services, which I had minimized over here. And now when I replicate from here, what should happen is it should replicate all the new objects from DC2 to DC1. So right click, replicate now, done. Select this, this is going from DC3 to DC1. Right click, replicate now, that is done. Okay, in this manner, if you expand DC2, guess what? DC2 should have as its replication partners the other two domain controllers, DC1 and DC3. So let's expand DC2. NTDS settings, and here we go. So let's replicate from DC3 to our server, and notice this this message over here from DC3 to our server. Active Directory has replicated the connections. Basically, you do not see any difference, even though in our minds we know that DC3 actually belongs to a totally different location. And the reason for that is that we have not yet set up any correlation between a physical network and a logical domain, which is benandbrady.com. So DC1 and the replication between DC3 and DC2 or DC1 is acting as if there is absolutely nothing difference between these domain controllers. In fact, there is a difference. And once we finish this exercise, you will see that from that point on, if I replicate between DC3 and DC2 or DC3 and DC1, you will see that the message will not be the same as the one that you see now, Active Directory as replication. In fact, it will basically say that it has queued the replication for the next time the replication is scheduled to take place. So once again, we're going to replicate from DC1 to DC3, and then from DC2 to DC3. You do not have to perform this activity from time to time. Within 15 minutes, the replication takes place, but if you ever have to push the replication, this is the manner in which you can do this. Now, just to complete this exercise, what we will do is go back to, let's go back to DC2, and in there run Active Directory users and computers one more time. And let's verify if the Active Directory replicated. If so, I'm going to expand this, and if the Active Directory did replicate, what you should expect to see is California and North Carolina on DC2. California was created in DC1, but you were using it on all on this domain controller as well. Let's verify this on DC3 as well. So going to DC3, and don't want to see the screen again. This is the configure your server screen. It runs the first time you log in to the domain. And I've done that after the server restarted after the previous lab. So Active Directory users and computers, and then over here I should expect to find California as well as North Carolina, and of course this will be there on DC1 as well. Okay, so just wanted to show you how replication works, and just to prove the fact that replication is working fine on the network at this point. If you're performing these labs with me, make sure that you go across this, you go over these tasks to make sure that replication is taking place okay in your network as well. If not, I would shut down all the servers, start DC1 as the first domain controller, give it some time, then start DC2 and then DC3 in that order, give it some time to settle down and try this activity one more time. If it still does not work, in the next video I'm going to show you how to troubleshoot by creating new connection objects. But if you followed all the steps that I've showed you so far, it should work just like the way it worked on this particular system. So that was a network. In fact, what you saw was this network that we have created before. Let me maximize the screen. This is the physical layout of a network. Of course, instead of the crossover cable, we are assuming that there are two locations, and this is the T1 line. All right, this is the physical layout. Now, what we want to do is we want to associate this with benandbrady.com, which is this particular network. In other words, what I need to do is the following. I need to define the site known as California. I need to define the site known as North Carolina. And then I have to go further and say that, well, on this site, because this is a different location, I need a network ID of which is separate from this particular network. That's exactly why we have a router, because we have two different networks, and the two networks will be routed by the router. So I have to first define the site, and then create the subnet. That's the second step. And then a third step would be to associate this particular site with this subnet. Once I do that on both sides, then I have separated my, then I have sort of mapped my physical network to my logical network, and that will also tell these domain controllers exactly how to participate in Active Directory replication. And then finally, what I need to do is, at this point, all the domain controllers like you saw were all in the default site, which is the first site, known as the default first site. What I need to then do is move this domain controller DC3 to this site and move DC1 and DC2 to this site called California. So let's see how the separation of the domain controllers within the site takes place, and how do we actually create the sites, the subnets, and associate the two together. So going back to our notes over here, let me show you the steps that we will take to achieve this. Here we go. The first thing we're going to do is create a site. In fact, we're going to create two sites, California, North Carolina. And then what we will do is create a subnet and associate it with that site. So the next thing to do is create a subnet. I know that physically we have created the subnet, but our benandbrady.com domain or Active Directory does not know the existence of the two different subnets and how they are actually supposed to work together. And then finally, once I have my two sites and my subnets associated, I need to make sure that DC1 and DC2 are in the California site, and DC3 is in the North Carolina site. So let's go about doing that. To do this, again, we have to use Active Directory sites and services, and I choose to go on DC1. You can perform this activity on any domain controller. So on DC1, let's run the tool Active Directory sites and services one more time. And once again, by default, it created a first site known as the default first site. This was the name that you gave in the answer file. If you had given a different name in the answer file, it would be a different name altogether. In fact, if you do not use the answer file and just use the DC promo process, the actual name is default first site name. This is a question that they ask in the MCSE exam. Alrighty, now, rather than create a totally new site, what I can do is use the existing site. So in other words, for California, I'm going to use the existing site. All I'm going to do is right click on this and then rename the site from default first site name to California. That was easy enough. Alright, so since my first site was already created, I simply renamed it to California. Now I'm ready to create my second site. In order to do that, you need to go to one link up, or you need to click on a container called sites, right click, new, and then click on site. And then over here, you need to type the name of your site, which is North Carolina. And then you need to say how this site will be connected by which protocol. And I'll go into details about the different protocols. There are two, IP and SMTP. By definition or by default, IP is the one that is available to us, and I'm going to click on the OK button. The other one is for fault tolerance only. So I'm going to click on the OK button, and it's giving me a summary screen over here saying that, well, you have created a site called North Carolina. It is not done you have not finished configuration the site yet. To finish the configuration, you have to do the following, and those were my notes. You have to make sure that it is linked to the other sites. Then you have to create the subnets and associate the sites for the subnets, and finally set up also known as a licensing server. So I'm going to click on the OK button over here, and here's my second site. Now look at the difference. I'm going to expand California, servers, expand servers. Well, there are no servers here because we need to actually tell our benandbrady.com domain that the server DC3 actually belongs over here. But that's a later step. So going back to our notes over here, what have we done so far? Created two sites, California, North Carolina. The second thing to do now is to create a subnet and then associate a site with that subnet. This is done together. Let me show you how. I'm going to minimize the screen. And here is our second link. If I were to minimize all this, you will see that there are actually three containers. Site container, and within the site container there is what is known as the inter-site transport container. And like I was saying, there were two different mechanisms of transportation, IP and SMTP, and we'll talk about this in a later video. And the third container, which I'm interested in right now, is the subnets container. And if I were to look into this, there is actually no subnets created. So even though in our TCP/IP definition, we actually created two subnets, in fact, we have a router that is routing packets between two subnets, we actually have not defined those subnets in benandbrady.com. This shows you the total separation between the logical domain and the physical domain. So we need to make sure that these two are associated for efficiency in our network. So to create a new subnet, I'm going to right click on this and say new subnet. And now it wants to know the subnet name. Our first subnet is 200.201.0. Our subnet mask was 255.255.255.0, and that is why it also says /24. And this was creating the subnet. Now I need to tell benandbrady.com or the Active Directory that you need to associate this subnet, which is the 201 subnet, with a site known as California. Click on OK, and we're done with that. So at this point, we have created a new subnet called 201.0 and associated that with the California site. Now, we are going to follow the same process and then create the second subnet. So let's do that again. Right click on this, new subnet, 200.200.202.0. This will be our /24, which is this. And this one I'm going to associate with North Carolina. So select that, click on OK. And here are our two sites, California, North Carolina. And then here are two subnets, the 201 subnet and the 202 subnets. And you can see from this link over here, each one of them is associated with the appropriate site. So going back to our notes, we have made some progress over here. We have created the sites, we have created the subnet associated with the site, and last but not the least, what we need to do is make sure that the appropriate domain controllers are in the appropriate sites. So let's do that. Here is our site California, and here's the site North Carolina. North Carolina does not have any domain controllers, whereas this one has two domain controllers over here. Now, what you can do is the following. You can right click on this and create new servers and create a server object. I'm just going to show you that it can be done physically. I'm going to call this server DC4 as an example. Okay, and click on it. Here we go. DC4 was created, folks. But you never have to do this, because if you have done a good job making sure that when you actually add additional domain controllers to your domain and ensuring that you have good connectivity between the domain controllers and your Active Directory is working fine, automatically what should happen is a domain controller object should be created for you over here. That is a good sign. In fact, if you do not see the DC4 object, if you were to add an additional domain controller show up over here, that means there is something that has not worked properly. I would start troubleshooting right then and there to make sure that this happens. Otherwise, you'll have problems later on. You can always create a new domain controller object, but quite frankly, you should never have to. So we already have DC3. All we need to do is move it out of California and put it in the right location, which is North Carolina. In order to do that, we need to move it. So we're going to right click on this, click on move, and select where do you want to move it to. I would like to move it to the site North Carolina. Click on OK, and here we go. It's gone from California, and if you go over here, it is now in the North Carolina site. If I were to click on it, and here's the NTDS settings, and once again, it has it's going to replicate between DC1 and DC2 from this particular site. Okay, and then we'll talk about how to make this replication efficient in the next video. But at this point, we are all set. We have created the two different sites. We have created two subnets. We have associated the subnets with the sites, and last but not the least, our domain controllers are in the right location as well. Now, why was this important? Let me try to explain this to you in a different way over here. Here we go. One of the reasons, or rather two reasons why sites are defined and created is to control the logon traffic and to control the replication traffic. Let's consider both. The first one is the logon traffic. When a user in the California site logs on to the domain benandbrady.com, look at the words that I'm using. When you log on, you're not logging on to a domain controller. You enter the username, you enter the password, and in the domain drop-down box, you make the selection for the domain name. A domain, folks, is a logical object. You cannot go and touch a domain. You can touch a domain controller. Domain controller is a physical object that is holding the Active Directory database, or rather holding the domain benandbrady.com. So our domain is actually located in DC1, DC2, DC3 and so forth. So when a user logs on, that packet has to go to a domain controller which is hosting the domain, and that particular domain controller should authenticate, build up the access token, and then give it back to the user. Now, when a user in California logs on, wouldn't it be nice that that particular packet goes to either DC1 or DC2, either of them does not matter, but definitely not goes to DC3, simply because DC3 is on the other side of the WAN connection, and this is a slow T1 line as compared to the 100 megabits per second network that you're running on the California location. So by defining that California site has two domain controllers, DC1 and DC2, you're basically saying that when a user logs on, it will try to look for domain controllers in the site California, and there are only two of them, and now definitely 101% it will never ever go to DC3 to log in. Your login will always take place either between DC1 or DC2. That is why you created the site, you associated the site with the subnet, and then you made sure that the right domain controllers are in the right site. What happens is the following. When the user, or rather when the computer obtains the TCP/IP settings, it knows what subnet it belongs to. That particular subnet is associated with this site, and that particular site has these domain controllers in it. And now when the user logs on, either DC1 or DC2 will authenticate this user. So hopefully you can see the connection between all the physical things that you've done in TCP/IP properties versus the logical objects that we've set up in Active Directory sites and services. The same thing will happen over here as well. So that's one reason why you set up sites. The second reason why you set up sites, and again we'll go into this reason in much more detail in the next video, is the replication of the Active Directory itself. Now when Active Directory replicates, wouldn't it be nice if DC1 and DC2 were to replicate with each other, and then between the two, one of them should replicate with DC3, and then DC3 should replicate with one of them back, so that you do not cross the WAN connections again and again between between DC1, DC2, and between DC3. For example, let's say that a change took place on DC3. It should definitely go to DC1 or DC2 only once, and once it reaches DC1, DC1 should inform DC2, because this is a fast connection over here and this is a slow connection. On the other hand, if DC3 is replicating both with DC1 and DC2, well, it's a waste, because it would be better if DC3 replicates with, let's say, DC1 at 1.5 megabits per second, which is the T1 connection, and a DC1 replicates with DC2, which is at 100 megabits per second. Alright, so in order to control that, once again, you have to define sites, and then within the sites, you will define how the replication of Active Directory takes place. At this point, we haven't done that. We will do that in the next video. We will basically define that when DC3 and DC3 replicates with DC1 and DC2, we have to make sure that there is more efficiencies built up within that. So going back to our notes, I think we've accomplished all the objectives of this particular video. We created a site, we created a subnet associated with the site, and then we made sure that our domain controller objects are in the right site. So the main purpose of this video is to make sure you understand that physically speaking, the network is totally separate from the logical network or the logical domain, benandbrady.com. And the way you associate that is by creating site objects. You're creating subnets, then you associate the site with the subnets, and then after that, you have to make sure that the Active Directory replication takes place between these domain controllers. So let's make sure that it is still taking place, and then we'll end the video right there. So going back over here, if I were to go to DC1 and then go over here, let's do with DC2. They are in the same site, DC1, DC2, right click, replicate now, works fine. Go to DC3, right click, replicate now. Now, do you see the difference in the message? Remember what I said, the message will change when you do that? Well, now it's replicating between two different sites, and so what we need to do is, we need to set up a replication schedule. If you read the last line over here, it says that Active Directory will replicate these connections as a next opportunity. That opportunity will be defined in the next video, which is basically a schedule that says that, you know what, these two are not on a fast connection. Let me tell you exactly when to replicate, so that my regular operations on the networks during business hours are not interrupted because of replication between these domain controllers across sites. So that's what we'll accomplish in the next video. So this brings an end to a video on Lab 2. In this video, we created new sites and subnets for the benandbrady.com domain. I thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you very soon in a different video in Active Directory.